Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Marvel Zombies Kingpin and Vanessa Fisk. As you can see, the first thing I've done is primed them with some matte white spray from Colourforge. I'm then going to use some Screamer Pink to paint the trousers of both Kingpin and Vanessa's dress. This will be followed by a wash of Carroburg Crimson. Once that wash has dried, I'm just going to use the Screamer Pink just to neaten things up, again avoiding all of the recesses. The first highlight will be a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. And the second will be Pink Horror just by itself. For Kingpin's waistcoat, I'm going to use some Balor Brown. And I'm also going to use it to paint Vanessa's handbag. I'll then wash those areas with some Army Painter Soft Tone. And while that wash dries, I'm going to use a Baden Black to paint all of their shoes. I'll also use it on the cane, as well as the little bit you can see of Kingpin's belt. I'm going to use some Corvus Black on Kingpin's tie. And then I'm going to wash all of those areas with some Nuln Oil. Both Kingpins have masks on their floor, as well as the human Kingpin having Daredevil's weapons, so I'm going to use Mephiston Red to paint those. And I'll give them a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. Then I'll go back to the waistcoat and I'll relayer the Balor Brown, avoiding all of the recesses. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Balor Brown and Matte White for the first highlight. And the second and final highlight will be a 30-70 mix of Balor Brown and Matte White. The black areas will then get highlighted with some Corvus Black, followed by a 50-50 mix of Corvus Black and Eshin Grey for the second. And for a final highlight and the highlight on Kingpin's tie, we're going to use Eshin Grey just by itself. I'm now going to move on to the Kingpin's shirts, and for that I'm going to use some Grey Seer. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and Matte White for the first set of highlights. And the second set will just be Matte White all by itself. I'm going to use a different method to paint Kingpin's suit jacket, so for that I'm going to use Wraithbone for the first layer, followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Matte White. And then finally Matte White just by itself for the last layer. With most of the model out of the way, I'm now going to move on to this skin. So for Kingpin's skin, the human version, I'm going to use Bugman's Glow. For Vanessa, I'm going to use Cadian Flesh Tone. And for the zombie version, I'm going to use Rakarth Flesh. All of these areas will then get washed with some Reichland Flesh Shade. After that wash is dried, I'm going to very carefully dot in the eyes with some Baden Black. Now this is just for Vanessa and hero version of Kingpin. This will be followed by Matte White. And then finally a Baden Black again for the pupil. I'm then going to move back to the skin, and for Kingpin I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone for the first highlight, followed by Cadian Flesh Tone on both Kingpin and Vanessa for the second. Then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh for the next highlight. And then a final highlight of Kislev Flesh just on the very peaks and tips of areas. For the zombie Kingpin, I'm going to use some Flayed One Flesh for the first highlight. Then I'm going to use Pink Horror to paint any sort of exposed muscle. I'll also do his tongue at this point as well. Next, I'll give these areas a wash with some Carroburg Crimson, along with his eye sockets. And while that wash dries, I'm going to paint the bone sticking out of his leg. For that, I'm going to use Morghast Bone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone. And then finally, Wraithbone just by itself. For the eyes, I'm going to use a tiny bit of Fire Dragon Bright. And then for the final highlight, I'm going to use some Pallid Witch Flesh. After this, I'm very carefully going to put his teeth in using some matte white. I'm then going to paint any gold areas with some Retributor armor. That's the bracelets on Vanessa, the cufflinks on Kingpin, and the tip of his staff. All these areas will then get washed with some Reikland flesh shade. I'm then going to highlight those areas with some Uruk armor gold. Moving back to the base, I'm going to use Evil Sun's Scar to highlight all of the red masks, followed by some Wild Rider red. I'm then going to use Abaddon Black to paint the eye sockets on both the Spider-Man masks, and I'm also going to use it to paint the mask of Bullseye. I'm also going to use the Abaddon Black to paint Vanessa's hair as well. I'll then highlight both the hair and the mask with some Corvus Black. I'll give a second highlight to the hair with some Eshin Grey. The final detail for Vanessa is her lips, and I'm going to use some Corn Red to paint in her lipstick. Next I'll use Gene Sealer Purple to paint the final mask on Kingpin's base. And I'll highlight it with a 50-50 mix of Gene Sealer Purple and Matte White. To finish off Bullseye's mask, I'm going to use some Grey Sear for his target symbol, which I'll then highlight with some Matte White. I'm going to paint Vanessa's base with some Dryad Bark, along with the muddy area on the base of Hero Kingpin. These areas will then get dry brushed with some Gothor Brown, and the rest of the base will be painted with Dawnstone. All that Dawnstone will then get dry brushed with some Grey Sear. Next, I'll paint the rims of the bases with some Abaddon Black, and wash the bases with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. And finally, for Zombie Kingpin, I'm going to add some Blood for the Blood God, just to add a little bit of extra gore. And with that, that's these guys done. I've really enjoyed painting the Kingpins. I think they are some really nice models. They're some of the best in the Marvel Zombies range. And Vanessa's not too bad either. They didn't take too long to paint whatsoever. In fact, they only rocked in around about sort of 3.5 hours for all three. And I did have an absolute blast while painting them. They're really, really nice models. If you follow this guide and you found it useful, please think about giving the channel a subscribe, because I've got plenty more Marvel Zombies on its way, and there's already plenty on the channel. Thanks again so much for watching, and well, goodbye for now.